when I was in Principal Secretary DMD, I never knew what SDMA is doing. I mean, I'm not casting aspersion on anybody, but I never knew what it's doing. They were not sharing anything with us. And we were doing something which we were not sharing with them. We were concerned with their responses. Now we are trying to work together, but certainly the role clarity is very important. I hope that in some other states also, this may be the problem. So there's a role clarity so that there should be synergy. And DM Act, it was revisited. It was revisited, a lot of consultations have taken place because people found that, yes, DM Act needs to be revisited, but so far, it has not been, its report has not been put in the public domain. I think it should be put in the public domain. And the role clarity and mandate clarity is very important. Now, the full-time professionals, the NDMA, it runs on the contractual employees. In this very hall, I think in some functions, I heard someone talking about that the whole disaster management machinery in India is running with the help of the contractual employees. So this is very important that you should have professional staff and they should have security of their tenures like we civil servants had, but why they are being employed on the contractual basis, I do not understand that, but this is a phenomena which we have to address. And separate funds should be there, I mentioned about that earlier, but central government unless gives any contribution, and you ask the state governments to create the fund, there is a problem. There is a problem because if you have the national platform, you talk about so many things, and you do not talk about giving funds to the state governments or contributing a share, then there would be an issue. Whereas state governments, they are more concerned, I told you, about the response. They are not concerned with the prevention. They are not concerned much about the mitigation. Yes, the WRD is concerned with the mitigation because they have to repair the embankments. So for that, they have got separate funds in their own budget. But so far as my friend who is Secretary of WRD Ministry in Government of India is there, but the state government level, if you think that mitigation can be done without any fund, then there is an issue. And of course, there should be action to increase the institutional capacity within the state. And then universities, there should be networking between the universities, SDMAs, the government, research institutions, engineering colleges, polytechnics, and they should be engaged in studies and research, and their study and research should not be only for the purpose of academic purposes, for Swanta Sukhaya we call, that should be shared with the government, with the DM institutions, and we should learn from their study research, and we should get benefited so that the state gets benefited, and we are able to create what is known as resilient India, and for the state governments, resilient states. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vyasji, for your giving insight into the functioning and highlighting the challenges and giving suggestions. So I'll straight away request Madam Sushma Iyengar, who is a member of the advisory committee. I don't need to mention much about her, but I'd like to say just two sentences. One is that she is the one who set up Kutch Mahila Vikas Sangathan, which is the first network for grassroots women's organization in Gujarat in June 1989. Amongst many other things, she also founded the ODR Collaborative. ODR is Owners Driven Reconstruction. ODR Collaborative with 7 other civil society partners and UNDP. She's written co-authored few chapters and all. I'll request her to kindly give her presentation. Madam Sushma Iyengar.
Thank you, Jain ji. We're at the end of the day, but before I begin, I would like just to go back to a small experience almost 25 years ago in a village where I'd gone in the evening, and it was a village which had just got connected to the grid. The village had just got electricity, and there was much celebration because they were finally in the mainstream. And then there was this one old man sitting there looking a little excited, a a little amused and a little sullen at all these celebrations. And I went and sat next to him to understand why was he being sullen when the whole village was celebrating. And he looked at me and quietly said that electricity आ गया तो अच्छा हुआ, बहुत अच्छा हुआ, लेकिन अब से हमारे बच्चे को अंधेरे से डर लगेगा. And that was a moment of pause and reflection that he created within that moment of a village which had just come into being part of the mainstream developed discourse and life and many more opportunities. I think this shift with the Sendai of bringing in the whole discourse onto DRR risk reduction is that moment of pause for all of us. It's that moment of pause and reflection to really grapple very seriously and truthfully, as Mr. Tikendra Singh has just said, on where are we headed. And I would like to just point out few of the very core contradictions and challenges that we are faced with today as a society, across states, across countries, but let's discuss just our society and our country. In the Sendai document, there is a small section, and I would just like to quote that, which says, managing the risk of disasters is aimed at protecting persons and their property, health, livelihood, and productive assets, as well as cultural and environmental assets, while promoting and protecting all human rights, including the right to development. Today, we are at a deep contradiction where the right to development, and everybody has the right to development, the most marginalized, which is what we all work for, is today challenging our own responsibility towards the earth. And this is something that we need to reckon with. The second challenge we are seeing increasingly across our society, the increasing individualization on the one hand, people becoming more and more individuals, which is juxtaposed with an increasing assertion of community rights. 3, we are celebrating through a lot of our frameworks and traditional and through our discourses, the celebration of traditional knowledge systems which have emerged from the sustenance of local habitats and a deep observation and relationship with nature on the one hand, and a complete alignment with global markets which homogenize our ways of being and living. 4, the more holistic our global frameworks are seeming, the more fragmented our local, really local resilience is becoming to climatic events. It's like I often say, the more we understand the benefits of yoga, the more materialistic we seem to be getting. So these are very deep contradictions and challenges which is constantly putting us more at risk, even as we find newer and newer ways of becoming more entrepreneurial and innovative to deal with these risks. And we now have, of course, a series of frameworks. We have the Sendai framework, we have the agreements in Paris, we have the SDG goals, we have a national disaster management plan, which is really very comprehensive, and we have the Prime Minister's 10-point program. What is our task really? Our task really is to distill the details from all of this and begin the urgent process of localizing, of decentralizing, and contextualizing these guiding principles at the lowest levels. When we do this, we will make space within this plethora of frameworks and DRR discourses for people's science and knowledge systems, all of which have emerged, as I said earlier, from a deep, intimate understanding of how nature works. I remember very grandly just when Katrina happened, and I remember the statement by George Bush at that point, and just at the midst of it, standing up and saying, we will overcome nature, just when nature has completely overcome you and overwhelmed you. This surrendering ourselves to this knowledge that we really have moved very far off from our understanding of our ecosystems, our deep understanding of our ecosystems, which is why we need to start localizing again. I'll just take 3 or 4 key challenges to look at what we mean by contextualizing and localizing. Considering that the built environment contributes to the enhancement of our risk to disasters, it then absorbs the largest component of our post-disaster relief and rehabilitation efforts and an investment. That's one. Two, the economically and socially poorest are at highest risk, and their vulnerability gets even more perpetuated post-disasters in traditional livelihoods, with the old disabled women, with the internally displaced community, with migrants, with minority caste, ethnic, and religious identities. The sacrifice of our environmental resources has become the single largest reason for our increasing risk. And yet, it gets sacrificed even further in the expediency of post-disaster rehabilitation relief. And four, the sluggish capacities of our local governance institutions has compromised the role of all local institutions to institute disaster risk reduction processes, leaving them even further marginalized in the face of large disasters and even less capable of responding to ensuing calamities. This is what I think Mr. Singh also referred to. These four, the local governance, are sacrificing our environmental resources, are not building back better, but just not building better. And four, are socially and economically weak and marginalized, are the causes of our risk. They are the symptoms, and they are the biggest victims of all the outcomes. More than 60% of all our natural resources and more than 70% of energy today are consumed by our cities, and more than 60% of our pollutants are found there. Bangalore is probably the best example. What I'm positing here is, when we talk of building local capacities, I'd really like to go beyond these trainings and frameworks and skilling at the local level, which I think every state, every civil society organization has got into the process, but it has become a routine, sometimes tokenistic, sometimes rhetorical, sometimes effective, and sometimes significant. We need to go beyond to see what do we need to change. And I would like to suggest that when we start localizing and we say Himachal has done well, Gujarat has done well, these inspire. But when we say a state has done well, it also highlights some of the effective things, but it also sometimes subsumes a lot of the aberrations that are happening. And therefore, we need to go beyond state, start looking at district level interventions. And I would like to really suggest that if we are really serious about this, seriously about risk reduction, let us take 50 districts in the country and benchmark what this means. We have to start benchmarking what decentralization and localization means. I would like to just put forward a few points to see what it means when we work together at a district level. Civil society organizations, local governments, district administration, the media, the academia, private sector, corporates, and community organizations. One, we should really start just building better. This is the first step. We need to, if the discourse has changed to risk reduction, we are not now talking of building back better, we are talking of building better. We have to move from reactive responses to proactive ones. The building industry alone contributes 30% of all our greenhouse gases, and this is slated to double in the next 20 years. The rich want to be consumptive and have a low carbon footprint, so we will develop a range of recycling and renewable technologies, but we will not reduce the energy or water or material intake. The poor are aspirational, and I have not yet heard that it is very fashionable to live in an earth house, even though they may already be doing so. However, we continue to find thousands who still want to upgrade their own material. We find an artisan in every place who would like to improve their skills and be able to do that. We need to support that in their routine construction. Two, we need to create a more enabling policy environment for conserving our traditional knowledge systems and livelihoods. And I think this is key, which needs to come onto the table of any discussion on risk. I will just take two examples. We keep talking of indigenous knowledge systems. In the region,
Sushma ji, may I kindly request you, because
in the region I'm in, you have the bajra seed. This is a local millet. The local millets are there across our country. Over the years, over decades and centuries, the region has evolved 17 varieties of the same millet. Because those 17 varieties, some of them will grow just with one because it's primarily a drought-prone area. Some will grow with only one rainfall. Some will grow if all three are there. Some will grow if only the last rainfall comes. Some will grow despite a high-velocity rainfall. And so when they are seeding, they will seed at least 10 varieties because one of them will reap harvest. This, to me, is resilience. When we slowly have turned the entire community, entire societies, into depending only on our PDS of wheat and rice, we have completely destroyed this knowledge system. And this is just one example. You take, for instance, animal breeds, the traditional animal breeds. Today, our entire wool in the country is coming from the breeds conserved in New Zealand, called merino. While all the sheep wool, whether it is in the Himalayan plain, whether it's in the arid plain, today the sheep wool is cut and thrown on the ground because we do not have a market for that. So they start mixed breeding, and when the climate variability hits them, invariably most herders will tell you that they are facing huge amounts of ailments and illnesses within their livestock. So there are of course hundreds of examples today of all the traditional housing technologies from Kashmir to Uttarakhand to Gujarat and Bihar, where traditional material has been taken. Bihar, in fact, did excellent work in creating guidelines for the bamboo house. So we have to start mandating, legitimizing, giving space for our traditional beads, to our traditional seeds, for our traditional housing material, for our traditional cloth, because these have gone through centuries of climatic variations and therefore are resilient. We of course need to see whether, in every district, to see whether the infrastructure is adaptable. What happens when we are hit, for instance, how do we cope when a power grid going to cope with a major blackout when none of the substations may be sitting right at the brink of a 100-year flood zone? Or what happens, how do emergency vehicles and disaster resources going to access the flooded areas to protect dense living areas if the roads are flooded? So a district starts assessing not only whether the infrastructure is resilient by itself, but to see whether they are adaptable. We need to start creating centrality to the agency of local governments institutions, to our municipalities, as said in the earlier one, and to our 3 tiers of the panchayats. Much is said about this, but invariably, in a disaster, their powers get marginalized, and therefore they get far weakened in the next calamity, however small they are. I will not dwell too much on this because tomorrow I think Binoy is going to speak much more on this. Today we need to take 1 or 2 interventions of what are ongoing in the government. Let's take the Antyodaya mission. It's across the country. This has huge potential. It has huge potential because the Antyodaya mission is with the Gram Panchayats. How do you leverage a national flagship program to turn that into a DRR agenda with the Gram Panchayats in the region? And so we need to take, whether it is the Swachhata and you look at it in terms of solid waste management to reduce the risk, or you're taking the Antyodaya to really reduce social and economic vulnerabilities. These are some of, there are almost 15 points, but I'm not going to run through this. One of the key points, and of course, I'll just dwell on the last 2, we need to safeguard within regions and districts all those who provide services, and I'll just give you one example of our construction workers and builders. There's a very interesting study from Pune which says that the homes that are built through our life cycles are of course built by skilled craftspersons and by migrant construction labor. They come into our cities to build for us. There are 35 million such builders and workers. A recent study shows that only 3.6% of us pay them the minimum wage. 64% of us pay them only 1/3 their prescribed due. We get them to work for 12 hours a day. We don't pay them overtime. We don't give them any housing. 66% of those who build for us don't have their own housing. 80% of them don't have access to electricity. 71% don't have access to basic sanitation. And we don't give them creches. Never mind not developing a relationship with them, we have not even respecting the knowledge and skill as builders. when we say build back better, let us say build the lives of these builders better. And I think I'm just taking the example of one service provider in a region.
Sushma ji, I am sorry because you'll have to another 2 minutes maximum because we need to have to hear the third
Above
panelist.
all, I think we need to create a policy environment where women are at the center of decision making at the grassroots. I don't feel too proud that at the end of the day I was the only woman up there. The ability to live with risks begins for women in the womb. They live with a social structure which compels her to remain vulnerable and therefore has only made her more resilient. So therefore, the ability to reach out to vulnerable, make choices which reinforce resilience, accept one's own vulnerability, and collaborate easily are inherent strengths. So let us stop talking of reaching out to women because they are the most vulnerable, but let's acknowledge the central role women need to play in DRR decision making because they understand vulnerability. Most organized bodies in the country today, if there's any one group of people who are organized across the country, it is women. Through SHG groups, through organized bodies. The largest number of elected representatives, a slew of policies that are soon going to emerge from the Government of India Ministry of Women, some of them quite radical, on bringing women into the mainstream, into the public arena. These need to be really harnessed within these select districts. And I'm reiterating this, that we need to focus and benchmark all our collective interventions in a few districts to show what is possible when things get localized. I'd like to end by just, when we say civil society organizations, I would like to just say that sometimes we have moved through these labels just as we have moved through panels. So from voluntary organization, I became an NGO. From an NGO, I become a civil society organization. At least I've become civil. But I think it's important to realize that the word civil comes from civic, from citizenship. And therefore, everybody sitting here is part of is a civil society organization. This covers the private sector, it covers academia, it covers voluntary organizations, civil society organizations. And I think the one learning that I had in Kutch, which has got very famed for its disaster management, and one of the reasons why the collective network that I was a part of was able to relate was we were a group of about 40, 50 organizations which was spread across the ideological spectrum. We were spread across histories and experiences. There was the far left, there was the far right, there were technical, there were scientists, there were corporate organizations all sitting together constantly to address issues in a district. And it is this collective pluralism that is very important. And I think if you can continue this dialogue, that is the first step in trying to reduce risks. All the rest that civil society organizations do, I think one thing very important that we as a body need to learn, especially voluntary organizations, is to really bring back volunteerism into the sector. We call ourselves voluntary organization. We really need to bring this back to address these issues of risk. And lastly, to just take a very contemporary metaphor, I would just like to end with this. That it's very important that as we make efforts to protect the cow, we have to make efforts to protect the ecosystem within which it grazes and breeds, and the keepers and the users. This is just a metaphor to realize that we cannot protect ourselves without protecting the larger environment and those who feed us. Thank you.
Thank you, Sushma ji. Now I invite Professor Ravi Sinha, who's been a faculty member at IIT Bombay since 1992. His work is in the area of structural engineering, specializing in earthquake engineering and disaster risk management. He is also a member of Bureau of Indian Standards Committee, responsible for standards dealing with earthquake safety and tall structures. Professor Ravi Sinha, please.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank the organizers, the MHA, the NDMA, NIDM, and others for inviting me to this important meeting. And these are issues which are extremely important, which would have a profound effect on how we are able to tackle natural disasters and man-made disasters in the future. And I'm going to be talking almost exclusively about saving lives from building collapses, and where are we, and why is it important, and what more do we have to do about it. So as is well known, more than 85% of the country is prone to one or more disasters. And most of the fatalities, they occur because of geological factors. So, and about 60% of the landmass is prone to damaging earthquakes. We also have large parts of the country in the Himalaya, in the Western Ghats, which are prone to landslides, which result in fatalities. And we also have issues with man-made disasters, particularly building collapses. Just in the city where I come from, which is Mumbai, there are more than 200 calls to the fire department every year related to collapse of either a building or part of a building. Being an old city, there are many buildings which are more than 100 years old. So these are all resulting in fatalities, in loss of life, which are broadly avoidable and which should be a part of our aim to reduce risk to these kind of avoidable disasters. So damage to buildings is the largest contributor to fatalities during disasters, and this situation is not unique to India. In the 20th century, nearly 40% of all fatalities in natural disasters were because of building collapse. And in addition to the damage to the buildings and the problem it causes, we also have a large amount of infrastructure, lifeline facilities, which are extremely critical to local well-being, which also get damaged during these natural disasters, which are also within the ambit of ensuring safety using the same means through which the buildings can be made safer. So if I quickly show you some of the statistics from recent disasters, so this is over the last decade and a half. If you just look at the last two columns, those are the number of buildings which have collapsed and the number of buildings which have got damaged. And these are all from the earthquakes which have occurred in developing countries. And the numbers in terms of the number of buildings which have got damaged are extremely large. If the same event had happened in one of the more developed country, economically advanced country, those numbers would have been at least a 20th to maybe a 50th less than this. And the reason why it is important is to understand that sometimes having a shelter is such a struggle in the economic environment which we live in that having a safe shelter is not even thought of the same way. But as we move up the economic ladder, as we move up the social development ladder, this is the right time to ensure that what we build is also safe. Here I'm showing what is very traditionally known and familiar to most of you, what is known as the disaster management cycle. That from the time when a disaster occurs, there are a number of stages in which that local community goes through until, of course, the next disaster occurs. What is important over here is to look at the outer ring, which is the development. That now the paradigm has shifted. Disaster management cycle is not a lurch from one disaster to the next and hoping to improve, but to have development as an underlying consideration in which everything which we do, and development is not just economic development, but sustainable development. So disaster management has to be aligned to it to ensure that we are not just safer before the next disaster, but also our development in terms of disaster management is not impeding our development from sustainability and from eco-friendliness point of view. So how do we go about managing disaster risk? That is the key, that if we are able to reduce damage to our buildings and our structures, then we are going to very significantly reduce the fatalities which occur. So, so what is it that we can do? Quite simply, we have to use the best knowledge which is available. We have to implement best practices, and we have to have competent people doing the jobs which require competency. Very simple to think as a concept. The problem is that if you look at the right-hand side graphics, the problem is that knowledge is primarily a top-down thing. The higher you go at the level of, say, affluence, the higher is the level of knowledge. While the skills, the ability to do things with minimum resources, the ability to do things in the way which is most compatible with the local ecosystem is a bottom-up process. The people who are the most deprived of the knowledge are also people who are most in possession of skills, often traditional skills handed over generation to generation, which are useful. So disaster risk management, really the challenge is to integrate the top-down and bottom-up, advantages or skills and knowledge together to the mutual advantage of everybody together. So how do we do it?